right, number 7 says an airplane flew a distance of 180 miles in an hour and a half. What was the speed of the plane? So this generally would be pretty straightforward. We just know that distance is equal to rate times time. What makes this question a little tricky is the fact that it flew that in an hour and a half instead of just 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours. So we have to work with either decimals or fractions, and you need to be comfortable with how to write 1.5 as a decimal or a fraction, and then plug it in and solve. So we're going to do it both ways. All right. So let's see. An airplane flew a distance of 180 miles, so that's the distance. So I'm going to substitute 180 for D. We don't know the rate. That's what we're going to solve. Okay. The time we know is an hour and a half. So 1.5 hours. Well, we know that the rate is being multiplied by this, so we know that we have to divide by 1.5. But how do we divide 180 by 1.5? If you remember with fractions, if you're dividing fractions, they have to be written as improper fractions. So we're going to do that first. We're going to do 180 is equal to R times, I'm going to change this to an improper fraction. And remembering that 1 whole and then a half, so this is a whole and then another half. And we can kind of see that this is going to be 3 halves, but how do we do that when we have a mixed number? Remember, we take the denominator, multiply it by the number of whole, so that gives us 2, plus 1 more. So we have 3 halves. And then just to see that again, like this times this, plus this. So it's 2 plus 1, 2 times 1 is 2, plus 1 is 3, and then you write it over whatever your denominator was, so you get 3 halves. And again, the reason that we're doing this is we know that we're looking at, okay, how many halves do I have? Well, you figure out how many halves you have in the number of wholes that you have. Well, you have 2 halves in this 1 whole, and then how many halves do you have left over? 1, so you have 3 halves. All right, so now we have 180 equals R times 3 halves. Well, how do we get this R by itself? Technically, what we're going to do is we're going to divide both sides by 3 halves. Okay, so we have 180 over 1, because 180, but like the whole number 180 you can write as over 1, dividing by a fraction. So let's see, so if we have divided by this, and remember when we're dividing fractions we do keep, change, flip. So it's going to be 180. Oops. We're going to change division to multiplication. We're going to flip this. Okay? So this is technically what we have. 180 times 2, 0, 16, 1, 360 over 3. Well, what is 360 divided by 3? That is, I feel like I keep doing all of these side things. 360 divided by 3. 3 goes into 3 once. Multiply, subtract, bring down. 3 goes into 6. 2. Multiply, subtract, bring down. We have to keep bringing down until we're done with all of the numbers there. 3 goes into that, 0 times 0, and then a remainder of 0. So, R is equal to 120. Okay. Kind of a shortcut at this point. Instead of saying divided by 3 halves, another thing that we could have done, because essentially what you do when you divide by a fraction is you multiply by its inverse, we could have done that simply at this point. and said, okay, I'm going to multiply this side by 2/3, and then I'd have to multiply this side by 2/3. That all cancels out. We're just left with r. And then we have the same thing that we just had when we were doing the other thing. 180 times 2 is 360 divided by 3, and we still get that 120. Okay? That's working with fractions. Again, the thing that makes this question tricky is this 1.5 instead of a straight whole number. Now let's look at it using 1.5 as a decimal. And just kind of remembering that 0.5 is the same as 1/2. And you can kind of see this. This could also be like 50%. And we know that 50% is half of 100, or 50% of something means half. So a half would be written as 0.5. So we're going to do that same thing. I'm going to do 180, because that's the distance, times the rate, which we don't know, times 1.5, because that's an hour and a half. Here, the rate is being multiplied by this. To undo it, we're going to divide. Oops. So 180 divided by 1.5. We can't have a decimal in the divisor when we're dividing, so we have to get rid of this. The way we get rid of it is we move the decimal point one place here. If we do it here, we have to do it here, because essentially what we're doing is we're multiplying this by 10 and multiplying this by 10. So we move that decimal place over to here. This decimal would normally be here if there was no decimal. It's always at the end. And then we would have to move it one place. We put a 0 in there as a placeholder. So now we have 15 goes into 1,800. 15 goes into 18 one time. We multiply. We subtract. We bring down. 15 goes into 30 two times. We multiply. 2 times 5 is 10. 2 times 1 is 2 plus 1, it's 30. We subtract, we bring down. 15 goes into 0, 0 times, we multiply, and now we're done because there's nothing left to bring down. So again, here, r is equal to 120. These are generally pretty easy, except when they give you fractions. So you either need to make it a fraction or a decimal, and then remember how to divide by a decimal or how to divide by a fraction.